Welcome to Radio Free Montclair. It's year 3 of Montclair Design Week and day 4 of this year's programming. I'm Ian Kerr. I'm part of the large core team here at MDW and a member of the eco-design consultancy Storrs. I'm really grateful to be a small part of this critical and year-long initiative that we're developing at Montclair Design Week to look at, to evolve anti-racist design and ecology. And we certainly have a long way to go. And this conversation is one part of this year's programming around this topic. And we're approaching it from many different angles as well. We have events on Afrofuturist planning and design. There's an Afrofuturist zine workshop. There's discussions in design, education, and race, participatory budgeting, the commons. We have in our Please Explain radio series, we're looking at where our waste and our recycling really go, who it impacts. There's other programs around food and ecology. The Please Explain series is also looking at African American histories in Montclair. And we're doing a number of things with our partners, the University of Orange. And this event today is designed to specifically connect with our guided walking tours, which also use a similar lens. So I encourage you to do those this week, and I believe they'll still be up after. So this event is also the first in a year-round series we're developing of conversations on race and ecology. And so we encourage everyone listening both to check out the schedule of the week, and we'd love to see you at other events. And secondly, we'd really love for you to participate directly in this series. Join our team, host a conversation, suggest a topic, be part of it. We'd really love to expand this in every way possible. You can also join the conversation today via the icon that's in the upper right-hand corner of your live stream. So with all of that background said, I'm really excited to welcome Prakash Kashwan. Thank you for being with us, Prakash. I'm going to just say a couple words of background to introduce you, Prakash. Prakash is an associate professor of political science at the University of Connecticut. He's the co-director of the research program on economics and social rights at the Human Rights Institute. He's the author of a number of really great papers that I encourage you to look up. They've shaped a lot of my own thinking and work we're doing at MDW. And he's also written a really important book called Democracy in the Woods: Environmental Conservation and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico. And now we were just talking, and Prakash was saying how his undergraduate degree was actually in physics, math, and electronics. And then you went on with your first graduate degree in forestry management, and then you moved into the social sciences. So I think this is a really compelling set of skills to bring to these questions. So I'm going to jump into our first question to launch this off, Prakash. And I think it's been apparent for a really long time that the Euro-American environmentalism, many of its key aspects are structurally and logically racist at its core. And this has been challenged for a long time, probably as long as the movements existed by indigenous people and others. But I think what really has changed is in this year with the powerful challenges of the Black Lives Matter movement, It's made for all of us, and especially white privileged people like myself and like the majority of the American environmental movement, to really confront the structural logistics of racism that's within the movement. And you've written on this. So I wanted to start, Prakash, by asking you about this, and about specifically where the Sierra Club, as the largest American environmental group, they came out with a couple months ago with this sort of mea culpa and an apology, and we're going to work and do better. And you directly said that this was like, a type of apology tour. It's a salutary gesture. So I'd love to hear what your take is on the background of that, and also why you really think that's not enough.
Right, right. Thank you, Ian. Thanks a lot. Thank you and everybody else who's involved in these conversations and the whole set of programs that you described. It is really important to have a variety of ways in which we can engage these questions and, sort of bring in both these kinds of discussions about the history and the politics of it, and then sort of fuse them with, praxis, trying to understand how all of this intersects with how we think about environmentalism in our own lives. So getting back to the Sierra Club's, the statement that the director issued after Black Lives Matter and many other activists pointed out the racist legacies of John Muir and many other, great environmentalists here in the U.S. I think it was important. I think it was, in a sense, good that Sierra Club and other environmental groups joined the conversation, because without that, probably we would not have been, talking about this so much in such a way. And so it was really helpful. But what was instructive for me, that this came at the end of a summer that I spent studying the environmental justice movement here in the US. So, as you sort of mentioned, all of my past work has been on the global South countries. And, only recently for past year and a half, I've been connecting it back to what's happening here in the US. And so I had this, the whole summer I spent going back through the early days of environmental justice movement and its founding movements in a formal way, because many people would remind us that environmental justice is as old as, European settler colonialism. So, and what I found in that, studying the early history of the environmental justice movement was that in March of 1990, the Southwest Organizing Project sent a letter to the group of 10 largest environmental organizations here in the US. And they sort of, described in this letter at length how the, this particular section of privileged American environmentalism was founded on very exclusionary ideas of what environment meant, right? So the whole notion of pristine nature and so forth, and we'll talk about that later. But I wanted to get back to this letter, which was sent in March 1990, and then the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that was organized in October of 1991 in Washington, D.C. And the director of Sierra Club, the then director, as well as the director of the NRDC, they were both present at this People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And there were extensive discussions. So when these statements came out earlier this summer, what I was surprised to see was that none of these statements actually mentioned the environmental justice groups in this particular context. They didn't mention that we've been having these debates for all these decades, right? Not years, not months, but decades. And so that to me tells us that, by their own accord, there's some disconnect there. And I obviously felt that we needed to talk about this in a much larger context. And so my piece was sort of an attempt to do that, and also to connect the debates here to the impact that American environmentalism has had in the rest of the world, like in the global South.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, Prakash, is the other part of that deep history is, the First Nations resistance to it that goes quite far back, that I think is really important. Where, and this is now getting at what you're saying with this idea of a pristine wilderness, right? That the founding assumption of the environmental movement is there is a thing called wilderness, and it's a thing that doesn't have people in it. And it, and that thing called wilderness had to be actually manufactured. And it was manufactured through a combination of, genocide and ethnic cleansing, and resisted at every step, especially when the park system was developed. That required the removal of the First Nations people that lived in, Yosemite or Glacier and elsewhere. And so I wonder, if you could talk about this idea of this pristine myth that becomes a kind of foundational construct to American environmentalism.
Right. So, this is a long and sort of complex history. And here, I think we will talk mostly in the context of American sort of, European settler colonialism here in America, and Americas beyond, US. But there's exactly a parallel history of European colonialism in the global South, where we had exactly the same kind of dynamics play out, right?
Yeah.
So talking about one actually sort of, automatically speaks for that other process that happened elsewhere in the world. And so I think the sort of the biggest thing to think about is that, people like the great American environmentalists that we've been talking about, when they ventured into wilderness, they saw that the nature there was already protected, right? It was already in such a shape that they wanted to keep it, like, quote unquote pristine. But and when these environmentalists were conducting their research studies, or tours, or staying there, they encountered Native Americans, indigenous people, First Nation people, in a variety of ways. And in fact, in many cases, the members of First Nation communities or Native Americans were assisting them in their research.
Yeah.
And in many cases, these environmentalists benefited from the knowledge, very deep, intimate knowledge of the landscape and the species that Native Americans had, right? But they never actually acknowledged that. So in today's world, we would call it something like, academic cheating or plagiarism, right? You're lifting somebody else's knowledge without acknowledging them. Moreover, when they did mention these people, they were mentioned in a very derogatory kind of language, right? So, 4 hands on my boat, and, sort of some very, very distasteful references to non-white people. Now, this sort of, this should force us to ask, why was it, right? So there's been a lot of discussion about saying that, the mainstream environmentalism doesn't recognize the knowledge of Native Americans, people of color, and so forth, right? But in their case, they were actually researching, and they were actually benefiting from the knowledge that these people had, right? So it's out of question that they wouldn't recognize, or they wouldn't know of their knowledge of nature. right? So, and the point I'm trying to make is that this enterprise was fundamentally racist at its core, as you said, right? And I think it is fundamentally racist in a socio-cultural way, but it is also fundamentally racist in a civilizational sense. That Europeans, Americans, British colonial people, they all believe that civilization means what we do in a particular way. So there's been a path of quote unquote development through industrial revolution. You move out of agriculture and forest based subsistence kind of lifestyles and livelihoods, and you move on to industrialization, urbanization, and so forth. And so this assumption that what we have achieved in terms of what Europeans and Americans have called progress, modernity, development, only that counts for civilization.
Yeah.
Everything else is wilderness. And so you include people in wilderness at a sociological level, but you want to exclude them at a biophysical level because you don't want to see people of color within your pristine wilderness landscapes. So I think those were the kind of core, the root ideas of why American and European environmentalism ended up becoming so exclusionary.
Yeah, so I think just to paraphrase really fast, we have this model that's evolutionary, developmental of civilization, where we imagine at the bottom is the indigenous, and then you get agriculture, and then you eventually become glorious British people.
Right.
But what's really important, I think, here to understand in what you're saying, Prakash, is that at that first step, the people are so primitive in this worldview that they have no impact on the environment. So we can call it wild. And I think what's really important to understand, and I think will ground the rest of our conversation and where you're going, is that indigenous people, First Nations people, were co-shaping these environments in phenomenally sophisticated ways the world over, as you're saying, in what now is the global South, as well as North America. And there's extensive research. And so I just want to quickly say this. There's extensive research that the most biodiverse parts of Amazonia, for example, are heavily co-shaped by people. The very soil was fabricated. This very particular black soil, they fired clay to put beneath it. The oak forests of the Northeast were, co-shaped into existence by the Lenni Lenape and others. There's an enormous amount of research in California on the same thing, in Australia. And so the idea that you could separate, that you could imagine before 1491, there was just a few people in North America, and they just lived in harmony with a thing called wilderness.
Right.
And then it fit into this evolutionary hierarchy model you're talking about, is really not true. You have sophisticated people tending to an ecosystem and co-shaping it. And I think this is really important because the American environmental movement wants us to believe that there's a thing called non-human wilderness.
Right. And I'm so happy you mentioned it, because there's a parallel body of research in Africa on black soils and black earth. And of course, Amazonia is where it all started. But and also for anyone in our audiences who've been to great safaris in African savanna or similar landscapes in Asia, anywhere we see a savanna that has always been shaped by the interventions of controlled fire in the landscape by Native Americans or Native people and other kinds of rural communities. So there is no landscape without human intervention in that sense. And I think understanding this is sort of fundamental, as you said, to sort of scrutinize this notion of pristine wilderness, the science of it, right? And again, I want to sort of emphasize that oftentimes there's this discussion of, well, your science is well and good, but you don't think about people, right? This is not what we are saying, right? We are saying your science is wrong, it's misfounded, wrong and incomplete, it's founded on wrong kind of premises, and we have seen how this has had implications for the science of conservation itself. And we can, depending on how much time we have, we can talk more about that science as well.
So I just want to emphasize this, that it's not, as you say, an argument between the social sciences versus biological and ecological sciences, but it's really that the environmental movement has missed, I would say, a 30, 40, 50 year development of a historical ecology that has carefully paid attention to how humans have been entangled with the environments they lived. And I think there's like a number of popular books that have made this really clear, like Charles Mann's 1491, that shows us in our North American context, or in the context of the Americas, we're talking about 100 million people. We're not talking about a few people. And we're talking about enormous sophisticated forms of co-shaping, the movement of plants, animals, seeds, trade routes, as you're talking about controlled fire and management. And it's really that, if just to go back really fast to the foundational moment of American conservation with, the Muirs and the Thoreaus and what have you, they're coming after 90% of those people have been killed, and the rest have been, with the Trail of Tears, they have been moved off those lands. So they show up and they see them in a certain state and think they're in wilderness, but really, whether it was in South America or North America, they're showing up right after the people are gone.
Right. And if I could add real quick here, there's also evidence that it was not just this kind of pre-park, so you could very well think that, the settlers came in, the pioneer settlers, and they sort of, committed this genocide, and environmentalists sort of were only sort of tapping into that kind of quote unquote vacuum, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's one part of this story. The other part of this story is that after the founding of the national parks, in many places there were, people were thrown out of those lands.
Absolutely.
And there were policies put in place to make sure that not just Native Americans, the Black people couldn't claim land despite there being a law about it. And they used conservation as a tool to sort of, exclude people from gaining access to land. And I think there's been research on this, but that research has yet to be fully sort of connected with this debate on conservation.
Can you say more about that, about these practices of exclusion, and how they're coming about, and what they mean concretely for how we think of the environment and who has access to what?
So I'm getting deeper into this whole subject now, as I mentioned. But the act, and you'll have to remind me the name of the act that came right after the Civil War, where freed slaves were entitled to a certain amount of land. Yeah. Right. And so this act was sabotaged in many places in the name of conservation, because you had this quote unquote pristine land that could not be given away to. And on the other hand, you had the entire the sort of the structure of zoning and redlining and so forth, which was used to segregate urban areas. Yeah. Right? And so there were multiple processes going on at the same time, both in the wilderness and in the cities, which meant that you couldn't get land if you were a Native American or you African American. The big challenge in this research is, and I'm going to leave it out for Q&A and somebody else to sort of pick it up and get into some kind of a research project, is that the connection between the land claim by freed slaves and African Americans and the whole discussion of the founding of national parks, it seems that there is some kind of geographical separation, right? So the areas where you have most of the national parks are areas where you have the first Native Americans.
Yeah.
And freed slaves mostly lived in areas that were predominantly agricultural lands.
Yeah.
But there are these really, interesting connections, and some of this discussion sort of gets back to Latinx communities and their role in, farming and what happened after the abolition of slavery and so forth. So it's a fascinating, but it's a deep subject that I'm yet to.
Yeah, I think it's again, we're there's so much to talk about and so little time, but I think it's really important to stress, like, where redlining as a general term for a set of urban, suburban, agricultural territories is directly connected to reservation type policies on the indigenous side. So what's happening to African Americans and what's happening to First Nations people are not like two entirely separate things.
Right.
And the environmental movement isn't some neutral force in this, but they're actually an active participant that shapes America into a racial geography, and that what we call nature is a byproduct of that racial geography. The same way red line districts are a byproduct of this sort of political geography.
Yeah.
I just want to mention, Prakash, a couple useful, there's a really good book people could look at, Dispossessing the Wilderness. I don't know if you know this one, about the subtitles Indian Removal and the Making of National Parks. There's a number of other books, but I think there's a really important history for people to see that these are not neutral things that are, I think, so often claimed, like national parks are the greatest of, sort of agnostic, neutral American achievements.
Right.
I want to sort of pivot a bit and go conceptually a little deeper, and then turn to what a lot of your research coming from the Global South offers as an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to just hear your thoughts on, because when we were talking earlier, you said this is, your favorite, this is where you're doing a lot of research right now. And the concept of nature, and this is coming back to, the hard sciences and facts, is already framed as a world without people. That's the natural world. And then we have the social world, and we'll put people in that. And that once you have that implicit divide, which I don't know if you would agree with me, but that's a foundational divide of white supremacy, of this racial model. So I wonder if you could quickly speak to your thoughts on that.
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, this nature society distinction is directly linked to this kind of linear civilizational model, right? Yeah. So you become a modern civilization only if you left wilderness behind in your own everyday life, right? Yeah. So if you're still in the wilderness, you are sort of primitive people, right? Yeah. But if you conquered nature and you live in spaces that are your own, that are social spaces devoid of any kind of risk or even direct sort of contact with nature, then you are modern civilization, right? Air conditioning, right? And you could, you could get fruits from Africa coming to you out of season and all of those kinds of things. And then I mean this as a practical example, right? I don't necessarily mean like moral judgments, even though I think now is the time when we should start thinking about these things in moral terms. And so this distinction, nature society distinction, is directly related to this kind of linear civilizational model. And the other sort of part of this triangle that I want to connect real quick without actually going through a long detour is this notion of the supremacy of the individual, right?
Yeah.
The individual being, the whole notion of freedom and, all of the paraphernalia that comes with that, the individualistic thinking and lifestyle, is kind of directly connected to sort of this triangle of modernity, primitive nature, and the individual who's secure and who's autonomous and so forth. And if I think this is a good moment to sort of talk about how this distinction between nature and society, and the emphasis on the individual as the paramount expression of humanity, as opposed to sort of primitive societies who are kind of controlling the individual's freedom in some way.
Yeah.
Right? This means that you separate yourself from nature, but you see yourself as an individual who want to do good for the environment or good for the nature. And that's where you have this notion of, we were talking about earlier about this notion of heroic environmentalism. And so how, every great American environmentalism we think of, they are always known for being heroic, right? Being confronting the civilizational attack on the environment as an individual. So, I was thinking about Rachel Carson and how her whole campaign was about calling to hold the powerful actors in the state and the market, like business people, corporations, and the leaders who were supposed to regulate the environmental pollution. Her whole campaign was focused on that. But if we actually sort of listen to the folklore about Rachel Carson, it is all about the Rachel Carson, the hero.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was a funny anecdote to lighten up a little bit, if it is okay. There was an anthology of essays written by Carson, I think. And this particular editor, I think she included all of the Carson's work that had a great sort of profound political impact, right? And so the editor kind of justified her selection of Carson's writings based on how relevant they were to the larger societal debate on environment. And so the reviewer who reviewed this book for the New Yorker, I think, said that, it's a strange criteria to think about political relevance to talk about a literary figure. So they wanted to paint, they were so keen on painting Carson as a literary figure, precisely because of what I argue is this paramount importance of individual in the industrially developed societies, let's say. So, to me, this is a triangle of individualism, nature society separation, and this notion of primitive people who need to be, to be carefully monitored so that they don't destroy nature. Because the next step, and this is, I'll really let you come back in, the next step of making this distinction between primitive people living in primitive landscapes and civilizational people living in civilization is to say that because these people are primitive, they don't know how to take care of nature.
Yeah.
So we need to not only exclude them, but we need to control them so that they don't destroy nature. And this was a big argument at the end of European colonialism in Africa, where the Europeans were apparently worried that once these people become independent, they'll eat away all the lions and all the wilderness and so forth.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's this, the deeper you go, you see that sort of Christian metaphysics that assumes humans are inherently bad, and so that as you say, once you get civilized and you become a kind of universal human that's no longer attached to any geography or place and you're fully civilized, wilderness is now back in its ideal, Christian state of nature. But that humans need to return to it for like a spiritual uplift. So you don't go there to interact with it. That's off limits, and that makes indigenous people, First Nations people, farmers, failed, because they rely on it and they damage it. Whereas great conservationists, we gently step and leave no trace, and we go there for a kind of spiritual uplift. And the moment all of these things come together, there's in a way no way to go back to this idea that we could live differently with the environment, and value the models of other cultures, other peoples, as ways of co-shaping. And I think, just as an aside, before we start to think about maybe some practical models coming out of the global south in this, I think, this becomes like paramount in things like native and invasive, where science then says, well, if humans are interacting with it, it falls into the invasive category. But if it showed up all on its own in a pristine way, it's called native. And the terms then correlate directly and evolve directly with our political American nativism, that you were getting back to with the Civil War and what have you. And you can trace these both forward. But if it's okay, Prakash, we could, I'd love to start to think with you about alternative frameworks that are outside of this kind of Western paradigmatic model of nature versus culture and versus the individual, that imagine a world without people is sort of the natural and ideal state.
Right. So, and before I get into this, let's remember that we do need to come back to sort of talk about not just, the sort of any kind of alternative ideal models that we can look up to, but also sort of think carefully about our current lifestyles.
Yes.
And what to do about it, right? So I think these are two interrelated but still separate projects. And I think this other project is equally sort of important. So and I think this is also a good example where we can talk about this social science divide that's often talked about. So one of the most important angle to sort of think about is this this question of food and subsistence production of food. And there's been quite a bit of sort of quantitative research which has tried to map, what percentage of world's population is fed by the energy intensive, environmentally destructive model of industrial agriculture, versus what percentage of world's population is fed by the, by default agroecological models of subsistence farming. And I'm sort of, I'm posing these as two sort of, opposite models just for the sake of clarification. Yes. There's of course all kinds of, it's in a long spectrum there. So the data actually shows that a majority of the world's population, even today, is fed by what some would call as primitive models of agriculture. And these quote unquote primitive models of agriculture are good for the soil, And soil, as you already mentioned, is basically the foundation of human civilization, right? Despite all the technological development, we still need soil for all kinds of things. So these subsistence models of agriculture are good for soil. They don't create chemical runoffs that then go and create eutrophication in water bodies and rivers and so forth, right? So they're good for the water bodies, and they provide different kinds of ecological niches within natural landscapes. So they're also good for the ecological processes. And there's, University of Michigan ecologists, they've done systematic research on this, and they've shown that the most effective, most enduring kind of models of conservation would look like, a part of landscape which is sort of wilderness, natural forest areas, surrounded by or interspersed by small scale subsistence farming. So these are the areas that ecologists have found to be the most biodiverse and the most ecologically resilient areas. And there've been a variety of research also in the wake of a variety of natural disasters, although none of them are purely natural. All disasters are human caused in that sense. But research has also shown that this kind of mixed cropping, subsistence, non-energy intensive, non-chemical agricultural models are also more resilient to storms and hurricanes, and relatively speaking, right? If there's a big storm, it just blows away everything. But so so one big part of our conversation going forward has to do with the question of food, because the industrial model of agriculture is the second largest consumption, point of consumption for fossil fuels, and thereby global climate change.
Yeah.
And this is something that is sort of innate to whatever we do, right? We need food. Everybody needs food. We produce our own food. And so if we need to think about how to look for a balance between environment and us, I think food is the first place to look at. And as you know, food is also the place where a lot of these injustices are produced, whether it's the question of farm workers or the question of violence against other species who we kill through the use of pesticides and fertilizers and so forth.
No, I think to broaden that question, like is to say that all species eat, and the food question as an ecosystemic one is, how do we all eat? And I think some of the research you're pointing to, and I'd love it if you were to mention for people a couple resources here. But there's certainly in Amazonia, like William Bailey's work, The Cultural Forests of the Amazon, looks at precisely this question of like how both forest and subsistence farming that's interspersed, that's actually far more biodiverse.
Right.
And there's a kind of irony here that some of the most biodiverse landscapes are actually the most co-shaped by humans and non-humans.
Mm-hmm.
But to come back to the food question, Prakash, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on these models. Like first, is there a good resource you would point people to with what you were just saying about the research that's showing this kind of biodiversity of mixed use landscapes?
Yes, so we will put some of these resources together and put it somewhere where people can find on your website, etc. The work that I've read is by an ecologist, ecologist, Yvette Perfecto. And Professor Perfecto is at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor.
Okay.
And there's an entire, so you mentioned historical ecology,
Yeah.
and there's also an entire new science of nonlinear ecology,
Yeah.
which sort of challenges this notion that there's an equilibrium between nature and humans, and we need
Yeah.
to do some optimization to arrive at
Yeah.
this kind of equilibrium. And this new research on nonlinear ecology tells us that there's nothing like an equilibrium like that, right? And
That's
so I think we will put together a
yeah.
variety of resources from both sciences and social sciences. And then, of course, I have my own research, which has tried to look at the protection of nature throughout the world, and trying to explain which countries actually protect more. And so, that's another sort of part of the discussion, which basically tells us that world's poorest people are actually subsidizing us already to such a great extent that it's mind-boggling actually. And so this, whenever there's a discussion of in the context of global climate negotiations, there's this whole discussion of loss and damage. um, a lot of uninformed or semi-informed experts sort of frame it in terms of global aid, as if you're doing a charity to global south. The fact is that in addition to the fact that, of course, 75% to 80% of greenhouse gases that are causing climate change, the accumulated stock of greenhouse gases that is being contributed by the industrially advanced economies. In addition to that, you also have these other factors of nature conservation and sequestration of biodiversity in forest and soils and so forth. And because of that, Global South is actually greatly subsidizing the, the, the maintenance of the global ecosystem balance, so as to say.
So there's a lot there. So I want to
Yes.
quickly mention the first thing, conceptually, the idea of nature and balance.
Mm-hmm.
Highly problematic. And I think it goes back to sort of Greco-Christian roots of this thinking. But then coming forward to what you're saying is that, in fact, the global south and the world's poorest are, in fact, as you say, subsidizing the rest of us. And I think that comes all the way back to this point where you wanted to earlier make these two parallel things, where we need to think about the 10%, us, and what we're actually doing. And so if we could quickly sort of come from that into this issue.
Sure. So the other part of this, the triangle that we talked about, right? The individualism of the post-industrial or industrially advanced societies, this notion of linear development, and the sort of the pristine wilderness nature and so forth. The other part of this is the religion of markets, right? We have this, we as in the dominant discourses have this kind of great faith in the force of markets to do all kinds of things. And so I want to mention here, and again, for the sake of compiling resources that we are going to put out, a political economist and environmentalist, Canadian citizen, Peter Devonne. He's done, his life has been devoted to sort of understanding processes of deforestation and commodification and fair trade and ethical consumptions and all of that. And through this lifelong work, he has actually shown that this reliance on market-based models of environmentalism, and I'll come back quickly to sort of explain that, but just to make this kind of meta point about the whole civilizational project and it's the religion of market, which has also sort of appropriated environmentalism in direct and indirect ways. It has actually failed so miserably that there's not an iota of proof to sort of to
Yeah.
to continue even a day with this kind of thinking about markets are going to fix anything for us, right? And to mention Peter Devonne's work again, he has actually shown that it has actually set us back by several decades, because then we weren't actually exploring the solutions that we should have been exploring. So quickly come back to this 10% versus 90%, and why I brought in market is because there are all kinds of these, and now, now we are really getting into this part of American progressive climate movement, which looks at the offset projects, right? The carbon offsets. And when I say this, I should also mention, I'm afraid I'm going into all kinds of directions, but let me really quickly mention that perhaps the biggest success of the right side of the aisle on climate change has been that they have cornered the progressives to sort of just focus on us, right? If we can make an argument for Green New Deal, that's the pinnacle of our success on climate action, right? And Green New Deal sort of has all kinds of potentially problematic aspects to it, because we haven't incorporated a serious rethinking of our level of consumption into the debates on Green New Deal. And so because we haven't rethought our consumption, what we are doing is that, let me continue to consume and my emissions will be offset by a poor people planting forest and trees somewhere in the global south.
Yeah.
Those are environmentally destructive models that are also socially regressive in very fundamental ways. And this notion is now referred to as carbon colonialism. And there is evidence to suggest that hundreds of thousands of people have been thrown off of their land so that these lands could be used to grow biofuel crops, or growing forests that can sequester carbon and so forth. And so we are failing to mend our ways, and because we are failing that, we are continuing to exploit the global south in ways that are completely unforgivable at this stage in our discussion.
So let's just make this really clear. When we talk about market-based environmentalism, there's a part of that which is the consumer choice side of it, where it's just like, if we made better choices, and I think part of this is what you're referring to with offsets, but there's other parts, coming back to food, where when we shop at Whole Foods and we buy something organic, well, the easiest way to make something organic is to chop down a virgin forest in Brazil or somewhere else and plant lettuce. And so the idea that consumption could continue but just be better choices, versus that our consumption is the problem here, and that without us actually consuming less, some kind of degrowth model, there's no actual way to face the consequences of these things.
Absolutely. And so, I mentioned this manuscript on decolonizing environmentalism that I've been working with my friend Asim Hasnan from Bridgewater. And so as part of this research, I went to this consumer cooperative, local consumer cooperative, to request them to let us do a photo shoot for the book. And in the process, we talked about all this. And so we are getting into this conversation with them. So I'm not sort of, undermining their project. They're doing important work. But what you see in these consumer cooperatives with all of the organic food is that there are 25 varieties of cheese and 25 varieties of this thing and that thing. And so, the fundamental urge that we have to sort of, create all these choices, they can be green choices, they can be organic choices, but we haven't gotten rid of the idea that why do we need all of these kind of products and, so much of shelf space and so forth. So I think we have to begin thinking about consumption at every level. Real quick, another example. The largest land use in the US is actually lawn.
Absolutely.
Right? And lawn care is so, I mean,
oh yeah,
it can't be explained, right? lawn care, leaf blowers.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I think there are lots of things that we need to sort of talk, and many of these things are challenging, right? So when I think of leaves, for example, there's no easy solution, right? I mean, there one can think about a variety of models for sure, but we have to have these conversations and start working on these actual concrete things that we should be doing.
So let's pivot to the actual concrete, and let's start with the lawn, because I think, you know, that just to come to Montclair, and last year as part of Design Week, we did a survey, a statistical survey, to see what percentage of lawns are, you know, have pesticides and herbicides, and it's over 70%. We're up on a hill. It all flows down to Newark. It's socioeconomic. It's people of color. It's this perfect storm of race, environmentalism, consumption, that's happening right here. You know, and I think what's so interesting is that if you actually just simply did nothing to your lawn,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you would sequester carbon, you would produce biodiversity, you would start to make all sorts of other systems happen. So it's not really that part's even that far a stretch, you know. And then you could part of that you could forage, part of that you could grow, you know, and there could be this very simple cascade of things. So I'm wondering, you know, coming back to the whole food part you were saying, and thinking about this mix of degrowth on one hand, rethinking ecology in relation to race, you know, what are your thoughts here on how we meet it?
That's a great topic, and you know, I'm happy to say that one of the COVID projects that we started in the family was to sort of, you know, start a small kitchen garden to grow some veggies in our backyard here. And we live in a condo community, which, you know, at the sort of, you know, at least at the surface, it's like a cooperative model, right? So the backyards and front yards are all collectively owned, right? But so, you know, we made this like little, very small kind of kitchen garden, and we were feeling very guilty as we were sort of slowly forced to expand because we planted too many tomatoes,
Yeah.
right? And so one thing is that, and you know that there are towns where there are bylaws where you can't plant things in your front yard or in your
Yeah.
backyard, and you can be actually
Or you
fined for
can't
it.
even let your lawn grow.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. And so there's a great book, it's called The Lawn People by geographer Paul Robbins, and that's another thing we'll add to the resource. And right, so we need to be really start, you know, have these conversations about our land use practices, the laws that have been brought about as a result of the vested interest that the industry had in selling uh, herbicides and chemicals to the lawn care people, right? And so those are the kind of things, right? We need to talk about the cloth line, right? Why is cloth line such a bad site, right? And so there's been a long history of campaigns on these kinds of individual practices, which were good for the environment, but
Yeah.
they've been made, right? And there's research, there's, you know, the lawn people shows us, and many other research projects shows us how corporations launched a campaign. For example, you know about dandelions, right? Dandelions they were part of the recipe when
Oh, yeah.
right? And they were systematically, you know, there was a campaign to malign them as these
Yeah.
wild things that, you know,
Weeds.
weeds that civilized people don't eat, right?
Yeah.
So I think we have to get back to all of these basics, think about everything that we do, from driving to, you know, growing our own food to thinking about laundry. And of course, there are limitations to many of these things, and we need to be sort of pragmatic, move forward in a way so that it works at our individual level. So I would say, coming back to really the sort of the race question, I think urban agriculture and urban land use, questions of parks, for example, and access to land for growing food, local food. All of these are questions that will bring up, who owns the land, and are there public lands or unused private lands that can be redirected to some kind of community-based agriculture. And these community-based agriculture models also need to be designed so that they can be more inclusive, right? So, some of these CSA operations are all white in many places where you have, minorities that are not part of these kinds of projects at all.
Yeah.
And so these are multiple conversations, but I always think of, consumption and energy being the two things that has to be at the center of, how we think about this. And again, I think it's important to not just think about our own individual consumption, but to also think of who are the families or communities that have very low levels of energy consumption, for example, and how they can be rewarded in a development model which looks different from the model that we have. And how can we promote all kinds of, small scale businesses or small scale enterprises that can sort of revive some of the practices of, agriculture or gardening, et cetera, that they've been lost because of these corporate campaigns over a long period of time.
So Prakash, we've gone a long way. We've traversed much in this hour, and I just want to circle back and ask you a couple quick questions as a way of concluding. So where we started with the history of American environmentalism, looking at the Sierra Club and these models of that somebody could think are in the past, like, what's the really big deal? They came up with some national parks. We can't reverse whatever. I wonder what you would say to this. Like, why does it matter that we have the wrong model of nature?
So, and this question, if it is okay, I will sort of address in a global context.
Yes.
The model of national parks matters greatly because there's an ongoing debate. So a couple of weeks back, the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity, CBD, met, and they had discussions, and I'm not quite up to date on this, on where exactly they are in this formal process, but they have decided to sort of push for a 30% target. So we should have 30% of global land mass under protected areas. Yeah. And you can imagine that and right now I think we are close to 17%. And this itself, in 1990, we were at about 7%. So we've already, compared to where we were 30 years ago, we've already more than doubled the coverage of protected areas or parks throughout the world. And this has already caused innumerable human rights violations because, as I said, when we attack or when we want to direct land in certain ways and we want to promote particular kinds of land use practices or particular models of conservation, in the global south, it always means that somebody is going to be thrown off then.
Yeah.
Because there's a very different history of non-formal claims to land. And again, this is a very complex discussion that we can't get into right now. But the point being that every time we think about a global target for protection of nature on 30% of the land, or as ecologist, evolutionary ecologist E.O. Wilson has proposed this model of half the earth, right? So he's been arguing that we need to have half the earth set aside for nature. Yeah. And if you ask them which half you're talking about, I think he doesn't have a good answer to that, right? And so there are these ongoing discussions both at a formal level, not at a conceptual level, at a very formal legal governance level, where they are going to expand the coverage of what we call as the 21st century enclosures.
Yeah.
And this is going to cause, unbelievable miseries that, throwing people off of their land, causing food insecurity, hunger, and those kinds of things, where, we're already struggling on those counts. And
So,
this is going to make things
I mean,
much worse.
we're essentially repeating the history of America here, of these ethnic cleansings to make landscapes on the assumption, this Western model, that humans are bad, that they should be separate from the environment, when all the historical facts and the contemporary facts show that the right forms of subsistence, co-shaping of environments with people is in fact the way you produce biodiversity and the way you produce healthy ecosystems. So E.O. Wilson's not just wrong because it'll harm people, but the very logic he's coming from, that the only way to preserve the environment and biodiversity is to remove people and not see them as entangled, is also untrue.
Right. At a scientific level.
At a scientific level. And this comes back to the things like native invasive, how we think of the framing of nature, and that coming to the very beginning of our discussion, that the Western, the Euro-American model of ecology, with this inherent idea of this divide, is fundamentally a racist, sort of white suprematist model that we need to deconstruct, understand, put aside, and develop robust alternatives to, where we can draw on the traditions that are outside of these models. We can draw on First Nations traditions in North America. We can draw on subsistence farming traditions of people of color, of sharecropping, of any number of other practices, both globally and actually quite locally. We can draw on traditions of foraging, whether it's the dandelion or everything else, as in fact co-shaping techniques. And we can, and I think once we are willing to articulate that our environmentalism is actually part of the problem about getting to a genuine biodiverse model of ecology and an anti-racist ecology are actually the same thing.
Absolutely, and I think that's probably the most important conceptual map to keep in mind. It's I think the most difficult barrier in this conversation has to do with these social science divides.
Yeah.
And as I probably mentioned to you when we were talking about earlier, that many of our fellow environmentalist or progressive environmentalism, they're also partly to be blamed for these discourses, because there's been this very strong narrative that sort of paints the indigenous cultures in very essentialist ways. Right?
Yes.
And so it sort of valorizes the sort of the peaceful coexistence of nature and indigenous people in a way that deflects attention from our consumption practices.
Yeah.
So we need to challenge the science, right? And we need to challenge in the sense that we need to be going by the most recent science, and that coupled with the fact that there's a social dimension to it.
Yeah.
But I also always want to mention the political dimension. This is that when you expand the constituencies that are that benefit from particular models of conservation, as opposed to being harmed by particular models of conservation, we are essentially also strengthening the global movement for conservation.
Yeah.
because you have many more supporters who will support your model if it is an inclusive model.
Yeah.
And that sort of feeds back into people fighting for different kinds of environmentalism, as opposed to actually people having to oppose environmentalism because it is causing them displacements and food insecurity and so forth.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a political accountability angle to the inclusionary model of environmentalism. So I'll say on the question of political accountability, this year again, US Fish and Wildlife has canceled some of the projects, conservation project given to some of the largest NGOs, including I think the WWF, because there are credible evidences that these conservation groups have been involved directly in the violation of human rights in Asia and Africa.
Yeah.
And so if we donate to conservation groups or in the name of environmental protection, we should not donate to any groups that has been found to be engaged in human rights violations.
Yeah.
That's another important part, because then these groups will be forced to acknowledge the problem and hopefully address the problem.
Well, Prakash, I think, this is so fascinating. We've gone over time, which is a beautiful thing. There's so much to say about the fundamental topic of race and ecology, and then all the other tendrils that are critical to it. And, this is the first of many, and I hope we can have you back and talk with others in our community and follow up on this and follow up on some of your work. I just want to give it over to you if there's any last things you'd like to say as a way of concluding this conversation.
I think we, as you said, we covered a lot of ground, but it's very complex topic with multiple layers, right? And there's, in fact, language is an imperfect instrument. Yeah. And we should talk more. We should have these kinds of conversations in small groups and in communities and so forth. And the only thing that I would like to sort of add to whatever we have already talked about is that there are no black and whites here. Even if in terms of our formulation, sometimes we are forced to use phrases that may sound like black and white. But I think the challenge is for us to think about ourselves, our consumption, and how we are affecting the environment, and how our attempts to protect the environment have been harming for a long, long time. This is not a conceptual discussion, right?
No.
It has been actually harming people of color and racial minorities here in the US and throughout the world. And there is no question, no empirical evidence to suggest that what we've been doing so far has been working.
Yeah.
So we need to think in new ways. And fortunately speaking, there is evidence to show that there's a great deal of convergence between a socially just way of thinking about the environment and an ecologically and environmentally robust way of thinking about our future on this planet. So I think the more we can sort of get into these questions in these kinds of conversations, the better it is. We'll all find different solutions and ways forward.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful place to end, that that an entangled world of caring for humans and non-humans in different models is actually a way forward, rather than a purificatory model of a pure nature and a pure human separation, and that there's multiple possible ways through this on all levels. Well, Prakash, thank you so much for talking with us and sharing this. And as you said, we will share some resources, and we will attach them to when this goes into the archive, and that we'll continue these discussions. And
thank you, Ian. This has been such a pleasure. And I wanted to also thank Hannah and Colin for facilitating this. Yeah. And I look forward to our future conversations.
Thank you, Prakash. And
Thanks, Bob.
thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.